There once was a man whose wife had died, and a woman whose husband had died, and both the man and the woman had daughters, and the daughters were very good friends with one another. They would often have play dates together at their homes, and one day the man's daughter went over to the woman's daughter's home to play, and the woman pulled her aside while her daughter was not listening, and she said, "I am madly in love with your father. I really want to marry him. Tell him that and see what he says. If he says yes, I will bathe you in milk, which is very good for your skin, every day, and I will give you wine to drink. And my own daughter, I will only give water. That's just how much I want to marry your father." Well, that night, the girl went home to her father for dinner, and she told him what the woman had said. "Marriage," he said. "Oh, what shall I do? Marriage is quite a delight, but it can be very tormenting as well." And after he thought about it for some time, he could not decide. But he didn't want to disappoint his daughter. So he pulled off his leather boot that had a hole in the sole, and he said to his daughter, "Take this shoe up into the attic and hang it from the large nail, and then pour water in it. If it holds and doesn't leak out, I will marry the woman. But if it leaks, I will not." The daughter took his boot up and hung it from the nail, and she proceeded to pour water into it. Surprisingly, unexpectedly, the water swelled up the leather, and it sealed off the hole, and the boot filled up with water. She was thrilled, and she went to tell her father. "Father, father," she said, "come, you must see this." The father went up the stairs into the attic, and there the boot was filled with water. "Fancy that," he said. "Why, I guess I shall marry her. A man cannot go back on his vow." So he went downstairs and he put on his nicest suit, and he went over to woo the woman. And not very long after that, they were married. And just as the woman had promised, the very next day, she bathed the man's daughter in milk, and she gave her wine to drink, and her own daughter she only gave water. On the second day, she gave both her daughter and the man's daughter water for them to bathe and drink. But on the third day, she only gave water for the man's daughter to bathe and to drink, but she gave her daughter wine and milk to bathe in. And this is the way it went on. The truth of the matter is that the woman hated her stepdaughter. She despised her, and she made her do all the chores of the house. She did not give her any of the good food, but gave her the scraps. She found any way possible to torment her. And at the root of her dislike was this bitter envy she had. For the girl was sweet and kind and beautiful, and her own daughter was ugly and selfish. And one day she made a paper dress. It was in the dead of winter, and outside the snow covered the earth, and the ground was frozen, and the trees were covered with snowflakes. And she called the man's daughter, and she said, "Put this dress on, and go out and gather me a basket of strawberries. I am craving them. There is nothing else that will satisfy me." "But, mother," she said, "it's winter, and strawberries don't grow at this time of year. The ground is hard and There's snow covering everything. And what am I to do with this dress? Why, the wind will go right through it." "Don't argue with me," she said. "Go and fill the basket up with strawberries at once, and don't come back until you've filled it." And then she gave the young girl a hard block of bread. It was about as hard as a small block of wood. And she said, "Take this bread to eat, and don't eat it all at once. You'll have to make it last all day. It's not made of money, you know." Inwardly, she was thinking how she wished if the child did not freeze to death, then she would starve to death, and she would not have to have her around any longer. The child was obedient, and she went out into the cold with her paper-thin dress, and it was indeed cold. The snow was everywhere. The clouds hung over her. It was a blizzardy night or day. The wind blew. She could hardly see the trail. The snow was so deep. Her nose and her ears were getting red and freezing. Her feet were bleeding because her shoes had holes in them. Finally, she decided she would go deeper into the woods to get out of the wind. And when she did so, she came to a small cottage she'd never seen before. And in the window was the warm glow of a fire. And she could see 3 little men inside smoking their pipes. She was so cold, she went up to the door and she knocked on it. And when the 3 little men came to the door, they were only about as high as her knees, and the snow practically went to their chests. "Come in," they said. "My, it's so cold out there." She came in and she greeted them. She slipped off her shoes, and they showed her to a chair where she could sit next to the fire and warm up. The first little elf, he said to the second one, "Why is she wearing a paper dress?" And the second little elf said, "Fashionable, I guess." And the third little elf said, "Yes, but not very seasonable." Then the girl, once her hands were warmed up, she said, "May I eat my lunch? I'm very hungry." "What is it?" the elf said. I just have a piece of bread. May we have a bit?" "Oh, of course," she said. She pulled it out, and it was so hard she had to bang it on the side of the table to break it in half. She gave them the bigger piece and kept the smaller one for herself. And then they ate lunch together. And the first little elf said, "Dear Lord, what are you doing out in this cold? What have brought you out here?" "Well," the little girl said, "I was supposed to gather up some strawberries. I don't know where I'll ever find them at this time of year, but I'm not supposed to go home until I fill up this basket." The first little elf turned, and he whispered in the ear of the second little elf. And then the second little elf whispered something to the third little elf. And the third little elf whispered to the first little elf. And then the first elf said, "The snow is very deep outside, and it's hard for us little men to sweep it off our back porch. Would you mind helping by sweeping a little, just a bit in the back there, you know?" "Oh, I would be happy to," she said. "Where's your broom?" And they showed her where the broom was in the corner. And she went out on the back porch and began sweeping the snow for them. They gazed out the back window at her, and the first little elf, he said, "What shall we give her? She's so polite and kind." And the second little elf said, "Yes, she even gave us her last piece of bread." And the third little elf, he said, "And look how cheerful she has gone out to sweep our walk for us. What shall we give her?" And the second little elf said, "I will make it every time she speaks, a golden coin will fall from her mouth." And the first little elf said, "I shall make it so that she grows more and more beautiful every day." And the third little elf, he said, "I shall make a king come by and marry her." Well, while they conversed out on the back step, the young girl was sweeping the snow. And to her astonishment, there down in the white snow was bright red strawberries. She picked one up and ate it. They were sweet and delicious. She swept some of the steps and down widened the pathways, and why, there were more strawberries than there were in the summer. She turned around and looked in the window at the little elves, and the little elves smiled and she nodded their heads. "Go ahead, you may pick as many as you would like." She gathered them up and she filled her whole basket up with red, ruby strawberries. And she ate her fill of them. When she was done, she came in and she filled up the bowl for the elves, and she thanked them, and the elves all lined up the door and they said their goodbyes. "Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye," said the little elves. And the young girl went home. And when she got home, the mother said, "My, where on earth did you get these?" Wishing that she hadn't. And the girl said, Well, I was wandering through the forest, and there was a cottage, and out came a golden coin from her mouth, dropped on the floor. And there were three delightful little elves there, and more coins. And the more she talked, more coins came out of her mouth. They fell on the floor. There were heaps of them down there, almost up to her ankles. And her stepsister said, "Ah, look at her. She's trying to show off. It's not that clever. Anyone can do that." But inwardly, she was swelling with envy and jealousy. And when she was alone with her mother, she said, "I want to go into the forest too and meet those little men." "No, you must not," her mother said. "It's much too cold. You could die out there." "But you let my sister go. Come on, I want to go, please." And she pleaded and she prodded her mother. Finally, she said, I'll give you half the coins that come out of my mouth." Her mother finally relented. She altered one of her nicest fur coats so she could wear it, and she gave her a nice big pork sandwich and a big piece of cake to take with her on her journey, and then sent her on her way. She wandered through the snow, and she came to the cottage. But she did not stop at the door to knock. She just tramped right on in. She had some boots on, and she stomped out through the room, trying to shake the snow off. And then, without even acknowledging the little elves, she just sat down next to the fire and started to warm herself. The little elves said, "What are you eating?" "Oh, my lunch," she said. "May we have a bit?" "Certainly not." And little elf said, "What about that cake there? That's a big piece of cake. Are you going to eat it all?" "There's hardly enough here for me." What, do you think I could give any to somebody else? The little elves sat and waited for her to finish her lunch. And then when she was done, they said, "Would you mind cleaning a little of the snow off the back pathway? It's a bit deep for us." "Oh, of all the nerve," she said, "I'm not your servant. You can clean it yourself." And when she could see the elves were not going to give her anything, she stormed out the little cottage and went looking for strawberries on her own. And the first little elf said, "What are we going to give her? She's so naughty and impolite and rude. Yeah, she wouldn't even share us her sandwich." And the third elf said, "She just stormed out of the house without even helping us." And the second elf said, "I shall make it so whenever she speaks, a toad will come from her mouth." And the first little elf said, "I will make it so she will grow more and more ugly every day." And the third little elf said, "I will make it so she dies a very uncomfortable death." Well, not long. The girl was too cold looking for strawberries and made her way home. Her mother said, "Why didn't you gather any strawberries?" "Well," she started to complain, "there were these three disgusting little men in the forest," and out came a frog from her mouth. And the more she talked, more frogs came out of her mouth on the floor. And not only was her stepsister disgusted, but her mother was repulsed by her, and they sent her to her room, threw the frogs out. But this didn't make her stepmother warm up to her any. But in fact, it made her more mad. It made her hate her stepdaughter all the more. She couldn't stand her. And what made matters worse, she was growing more and more beautiful every day. And her daughter, despite the fact she was bathing in milk, was growing more and more ugly every day. Well, one day she made up a skein of yarn and she put that over her stepdaughter's shoulder, gave her an axe, and said, "Go to the river and wash this yarn for me out." Inwardly, she was hoping that she would, when she cracked the ice, she would fall into the river and drown. "Now go on, hurry," she said. "We don't have all day." And the girl went as she quickly went down to the river to wash the skein of yarn, carrying that axe. And as she was about to walk on the thin ice, a carriage came by. "Stop," he said. It was a king. "That is unsafe. You must not go out on there." And the girl turned and said, "But I must go out and wash the skein of yarn for my mother." And when the king saw the girl, who had been growing more and more beautiful every day, he fell in love with her, and he invited her to ride in his carriage. And of course, she accepted the invitation because anything to get away for a little while from her stepsister and her stepmother. So she climbed in the carriage, and away they went, riding along. And the king said, "My advisors have been telling me that it's time for me to get married. You're not married, are you?" "No, I'm not." And out came a golden coin that she put in her pocket. The king was astonished. "Very impressive," he said. "That was a very clever trick. Would you marry me?" And she accepted. And when they got to the kingdom, it wasn't long before there was a ceremony and they were married. Well, a year later, the new queen now had a baby boy, and everyone was overjoyed, the whole countryside. And the news spread all throughout all the land. There was announcements in the newspapers for the prince's christening. Well, the queen, though, she lied in her bed, just recovering from giving birth, but also she was getting quite worried and stirred up about her troubled past. She didn't quite know why she was so worried, but one night when she was sleeping, she had a terrible nightmare. All the clocks in the city began to whir and to chime. They said, "Do not let time deceive you. You cannot conquer time." In the burrow of the nightmare, where justice naked is, time watches from the shadows and coughs when you would kiss. In headaches and in worries, vaguely life leaks away. Time will have its fancy, tomorrow or today. In many a green valley drifts the appalling snow. Time breaks the threaded dances and the diver's brilliant bow. Oh, plunge your hands in waters, plunge them to the wrists. Stare, stare in the basin and wonder what you've missed. The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead. And the queen woke up from her nightmare, terrified and shaking. It seemed that her troubled past had come back to haunt her. And while the queen lay in her bed, the news spread abroad about her son's upcoming christening. It spread so far that her stepmother and her stepsister got word of it. And they said, "Good grief! I thought she had drowned in the river. It doesn't seem like we can get rid of this girl." And then she smiled. "I think we should pay her a friendly visit." Well, her daughter and her went to the queen's palace. They brought gifts for the baby, and they pretended to congratulate her on her good fortune. But when the king had left on an errand, they seized her, and while she was struggling, they threw her out the window, and she fell into the river. Her whole body was immersed into a watery grave. The stepmother then immediately told her daughter, "Quickly, get into bed and do not talk." "But why?" And then a frog jumped out of her mouth on the floor. "That's why." She picked up the frog and tossed it out the window too into the river. And she said, "If you do exactly what I say, you might be the new queen." She got in the bed, and her mother drew the blankets up over her face, for she had indeed been growing more and more ugly every day. And in an hour or two, the king had returned to talk to his dear queen. But when he did so, the mother said, You must be quiet, very quiet. She's not feeling well. She's very sick. You must leave her here to rest." So the king went over and spoke a few tender words to the blanket, and he left, not thinking any evil was happening. And the next morning he woke up and he came up to greet his wife and invite him to breakfast. And the daughter of the woman didn't remember to keep her mouth shut. And she responded to the king, "Out come a frog." And the king said, "My word, what is the matter? What is going on here? I can't help it. It's not my fault." And more frogs come out onto the floor, and the mother said, "She has a case of toad fever. It's very infectious. You must leave here at once. She will recover, though, soon." So the king left and went and carried on throughout the day his usual duties. But at the end of the day, the kitchen boy had just finished up washing the dishes, noticed in the moonlight as he was going home, coming up the little ditch that came from the river, a lone, ghostly-looking duck. Oh, he thought, the duck must have been a little anxious to get on his migratory route and arrived here early. But that was not the only strange thing about this little duck. The duck began to talk, and it said, "Does the king know I weep, or does he sleep?" Well, the kitchen boy did not know what to say to that. He was so shocked. And he said then the duck talked again, and he said, "And what of my guests?" And the kitchen boy now responded, "They are taking their rest." And the little duck said, "And what about my sweet little baby?" And the boy said, "He is sleeping too, maybe." And then the duck hopped up on the shore, and with a flap of the wings and a shudder of the body and a little rattle of his neck and his head, the duck transformed into a glimmering ghost. It was the queen. The queen drifted across mysteriously the river and then up the stairs to the baby's room. And there she took the young baby and held him in her arms and nursed him. And then she put the child back, fluffed up the covers and tucked him in, and gave him a goodnight kiss. She drifted back down the stairs and then swam away in the form of a duck. Well, the kitchen boy had gone up and he saw the whole thing, but he did not tell anyone. He was confused at what this was. The next day, the whole thing happened again, strangely. And on the third day, the duck also appeared, but this time it asked the kitchen boy to confess everything to the king and tell him that she had plummeted out of her window into the river and drowned. The kitchen boy at once went to the king and reported this, but the king said, "How can that be? She's in her bedchambers now. I just saw her earlier today." So he went to her bedchambers, and he pulled back the covers to gaze at his dear queen. But he was horrified to find not the queen, but her step-sister and the little frog next to her sleeping. He was horrified. filled his whole body with disgust. Quickly put the blanket back over her face because she was so ugly, and then left. "Take me to my queen now," he said to the kitchen boy. Kitchen boy took him to the baby's room, and when they got there, the kitchen boy said, "There, she's on the threshold of the door." And the king said, "I can't see her. What should I do?" He said, "The queen has told me it's for you to put your sword or pass your sword over her 3 times. So the king drew his sword and put it into the doorway. "No, no," the kitchen boy said, "up higher. You don't want to cut her head off." And he passed the sword over her head 3 times. And on the 3rd time, the queen began to shimmer and materialize right before his eyes. And in not but a few moments, she was a vigorous, alive, healthy human once again, just as she was before she fell from the window into the river. And of course, she was elated. She gave her queen a hug and a kiss, and they embraced each other with joy. But the king said, "We must not tell this to anybody. I have a plan. You stay here in the room until Sunday, when the baby will be christened. And on that day, you may bring the baby out and walk him up the aisle of the chapel. But do not come out before then." Well, they waited, and the kitchen boy and the king kept it silent. Finally, Sunday came, and throngs of people gathered around the church to see the new-born prince be baptized. And right up at the front was sitting that wicked stepmother and her daughter, who had a very thick veil over her face because she was still pretending to be sick. And the king leaned over to the woman and he said, "What kind of punishment should a person get if they throw an innocent victim out of their bed into the river to drown?" And the woman said, "Oh, that is a dreadful crime. The murderer should be placed in a studded barrel, rolled down the hill into the river." And the king smiled. And then the beautiful, true queen, in her white dress, carried her baby right up the middle aisle of the chapel. And as she did so, the stepmother and her daughter's jaws dropped. They were shocked. And the king turned to her and he said, "You, as your own judge, has pronounced your sentence." And the king ordered that 2 studded barrels should be made. And the stepmother and the stepsister were both placed in them, rolled down the hill into the river. And that was the end of them. And finally, the king and the queen could live in peace, and they slept very soundly from then on. Everything was just the way the 3 little elves said would happen. The end. The Three Little Men in the Woods by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm.